It is a work of art to serve as an entire lifespan. Mystery endures. A human life can't. Yet somehow through the mystical forces of memory and film, it does. Those are words from director Alan Rudolph on Ingmar Bergman's 1957 film, Wild Strawberries. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or a cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia Moroni, and today we're talking Wild Strawberries. So a quick synopsis of the film is, after living a life marked by coldness, an aging professor is forced to confront the emptiness of his existence. The film stars Victor Sjöström as Dr. Isak Borg, Bibi Andersson as Sarah and the Hitchhiker, Ingrid Thulin as Marion Borg, Gunnar Björnstrand as Dr. Evald Borg, and Nylund Kindal as Agda. It's written by Ingmar Bergman, cinematography by Gunnar Fischer, directed by Ingmar Bergman, edited by Oscar Rosender, and music by Eric Norgren and Goethe Levin. So today my guest is Aaron Strand. You might remember him, hopefully you remember him from our Double Indemnity episode, which is actually my second episode during my Billy Wilder month. He's also from Behind the Slate podcast, and he just wrapped production on his film Withdrawal. So first, Aaron, thank you so much for coming back on the show, especially with your life being very busy right now.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be back. I'm thrilled.
To get a bit more background and like his love of film, I highly recommend you go listen to the Double Indemnity episode if you haven't already. You can get more background there, but I'd love for him to spend some time now just telling me and listeners about, your work on the film, how many details you want to go into, the actual premise of the film, but like what it's like just, making your own film in today's world.
Yeah, well, it's a lot. So I just wrapped production on what will be my first feature film called Withdrawal. And I document the whole process in my own podcast right now. Now, my podcast Behind the Slate is usually a film history podcast where I could do a historical deep dive into the life and work of cinema's greatest directors. But while I was working on this film, while I was in pre-production, I did not have the time to do the historical research and also do pre-production on a feature. So I just turned the podcast into sort of a week by week, what it's like to make a feature film. I interviewed a bunch of collaborators. I brought in a bunch of like external artists and guests and just other independent creators that I find really inspiring to kind of see how they do it. And so it kind of became this, the podcast, honestly, kind of like it became this sort of wide-ranging love letter to independent art, and which is now coming to an end with production wrapping. And I'll soon get back to the history stuff. But as far as the film goes, I mean, it was an absolute joy. It is definitely the biggest thing that I've ever done. I've been building up to this moment for the better part of a decade. I basically every New Year's Eve, I make a silly little resolution that this is the year that I'll get a feature film made. And I've been doing this for 10 years, Felicia. It is depressing. Yeah. It's depressing is what it is. I
don't know if I would call it depressing, though. You actually achieved it. So
it was depressing until now. And now it's exhausting. So, that's the other side of it. No, but I literally just wrapped production like 2 days ago, which is crazy. I'm still processing it. Obviously, it was quite an experience. The shooting was broken up into 2 shoot periods. So I shot a little bit in August. I shot 5 days in August, and then I came back and shot for 10 days at the end of October, early November. Yeah, it was incredible. I'll do a whole debrief episode on my own podcast talking about these last 10 days of shooting, because let me tell you, they were hard and they were filled with drama and problems and things that there was no way of planning for. And we had to kind of overcome a lot of obstacles in the moment. Everything from like injuries to just like tons of issues that we could have never predicted. And that's indie filmmaking. I mean, that's filmmaking in general, like dealing with problems that you don't expect. Yeah, I'm still kind of in the thick of it. I'm processing, and it is really nice just to like sort of sit back into Bergman's world for a little bit. Yeah. That's the biggest thing, Felicia, is I'm so sick of talking about my own movie. You know what I mean? Like, I can't wait to talk about some other people's movies for a little bit.
Well, I'm glad to, take up an hour or two of your time to do so. Speaking of, you were pretty excited to pick Wild Strawberries, and it had been one that I hadn't seen in a very, very long time. I don't know if you remember the first time you watched this film or...
Oh, I absolutely remember. So I was an actor all as a kid. And between my junior and senior year of high school, I went to the NYU Tisch Summer High program.
Oh.
Where I went up to New York and lived in the NYU dorms for like 2 months and then studied at the Lee Strasberg Institute for acting over that summer. The scene study teacher we had was this a teacher named Jeffrey Horn, who probably a lot of people who have gone to Strasberg have had. You might know him because he plays the guy with old balls in Big Daddy. Do you remember?
My God.
Do you remember in Big Daddy's like,
wow,
his old balls? That's Jeffrey Horn. And, I was 16 years old, and here's this, quote, master acting teacher talking about the movies that he loves. And he was talking about Bergman. I'd never seen a Bergman film before. I'd heard of Bergman. I was like really into sort of like psychedelic culture or whatever. So I like remember hearing stories about people in the 60s like tripping on acid and watching Bergman films. But I never had sat down to watch them. And he said his favorite was Wild Strawberries. So as soon as I got home from that summer, I watched it. And I watched it with my parents. And my parents, despite, they're like down to go on the journey. They also and even though they were alive when this, they were born the year this film came out.
Oh, wow.
They watched it but were both like, they're just like, nah, it's old. Like they like the sort of like some of the clunky editing and like the rear projection on the car. They just like couldn't buy it. So they just like weren't down for the ride. And so that kind of maybe colored some of my first impression of it. But I do remember being quite, I was really taken by the like plot device of disappearing into your memories and memories becoming this like this sort of transient barrier that you could step in of and out of. And I remember that being quite moving. And it's a movie that I continue to come back to over and over again. I've watched it more than any other Bergman film. Probably seen it like 6 or 7 times now. And it's really grown to become one of my favorites. And I'm always surprised to hear other people who are Bergman fans that don't like it, because I've come across a lot of people who are sort of like,
oh, really?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people will lean into like, everyone loves Persona, but like people don't want to talk about it because it's like too film bro-y. So they'll pick like Cries and Whispers. They'll pick Fanny and Alexander. They'll pick, or if they're feeling edgy, like Virgin Spring. But Wild Strawberries, it's because it's so tender and because it follows this old man and it's this eulogy to old age. I feel like it kind of gets a little bit sidetracked as far as like, at least with people like of our generation. I don't hear it often being cited as their favorite, but I don't know. I guess I'm just a hipster like that.
No, I mean, now that you say it, I also feel that too. It's weird because he has such an insane filmography, like a huge body of work. And when you think about it, like I've seen almost all of them now, but there's still little stragglers in between. And I'm like, okay, I want to finish it, but it's still a task. This is not one that you hear as their top favorite. And I think it's like one of his most known ones. So no one ever picks something like you said, like Persona, or they don't pick The Seventh Seal as their favorite ones because that's the obvious ones to pick.
Yeah.
I like how you said they don't say Persona, so they say Cries and Whispers, because I was like, that's my favorite one. I know you don't mean it that way, but I was just like, yeah, that's very much me.
Oh, no, I do. I'm calling you out, Felicia.
Yeah. But Wild Strawberries, it's one of those. I mean, you said you watched it young. I would have not watched it as young as that, but I would have been like a late teenager. I liked it, and each time I watch it, it has a greater effect on me, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Just kind of getting older. We're obviously not the same age as this character. We eventually, hopefully, will be at some point.
Yeah.
But his films, I find, as you watch them through the ages and the decades of your life, they mean something different to you.
Yeah.
So, if you're ready, I guess we should just get into the film itself.
Let's do it.
You were saying, it's told through kind of like a dreamlike state. You get kind of vignettes of him reminiscing about his youth. And once we get the first one, you're like, is this going to be the whole film? How is he going to tackle going in and out of the dreams? And the first one, is him. I think it's probably the most artsy, like, where it's just him kind of alone walking on that street, and he sees that man who's like a faceless man. He decomposes, and then he's in the coffin and so on. How do you feel about just a film that's sort of told through dreamlike vignette and him just reminiscing about his youth? And can we believe him as a narrator? I know that's a lot of questions.
Well, the first thought that came into my mind, and I kind of love the question, is because if someone came up to me and like pitched that film to me, I would be like, yeah, good luck with that. Because honestly, it sounds horrible. I think that films based around dreams are a terrible idea in general. And that's kind of what makes this film like all the more miraculous. And well, I think it's partially because he kind of mixes dream and mixes dream and memory, and there's specific dream points, specific memory points, and then of course the one sort of like interrogation part where like memory and dream collide. So I think that that's really interesting, and he does it really intelligently as far as like building it into the plot. And he's also very specific in how the dreams are illustrating a different aspect of his psyche. He's very like psychologically focused on the script. And then I think the biggest thing that helps this movie and is actually brilliant, and if someone did pitch this to me, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, is by taking this whole dream premise and then putting it into a road movie, which gives the plot this constant forward momentum. Because I think that's the real problem with dreams, is that like they don't go anywhere. They don't actually like really lead to anything unless you have a character who's motivated by some external force or is being literally driven across the country and is forced to deal with like changing circumstances.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Because if he were to stay in that original room where he's kind of, getting ready to go to the celebration, maybe in the hands of Bergman, it would have worked. In the hands of many others, it probably would not have worked. You need to have, characters that you want to follow in the one static space, like a persona.
Yeah.
It also helps that he is very succinct. As much as like this is loaded, this is like a 90-minute movie. To have all that in 90 minutes.
Yeah. Another 90-minute Bergman banger. Like
Exactly. He really knows how to do both, but this is a film about reflection. We both get him reflecting about his life. We also get a lot of actual reflections, a lot of mirrors. He's looking in mirrors a lot. People are putting the mirrors up at him. We get Sarah, his former flame, who tells him to look in the mirror and says, do you see how old you've gotten? Look at yourself. And he's forced to face all these, realities. And if you're seeing this for the first time, you're like, why is everyone kind of being really harsh and mean to him? What is that pent up kind of anger? That's how I felt until you kind of get it going along. Not that he's a bad guy, but you can see personality that comes out through these people, through their stories of him, and specifically the women in his life. We have 4 women, essentially. They're, 5, his mother too. We've got the 2 Sarahs, played by Bibi Andersson, both of them. So his former flame, and then the Sarah, who is the hitchhiker. We've got Marianne, who's his daughter-in-law. His mother shows up at some point, and then his former wife, who is now deceased. And we've got a lot of scenes with these women who are talking about this man in very different ways. Because we don't get that much from him, he's reflecting on himself. So he only sees himself a certain way, right? We see a different version of him through all these women. How do you feel about that being presented that way?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Although, don't forget the simmering sexual tension with his housekeeper.
So 6, I forgot.
Oh my God. That last line at the end when she's like, I'll leave the door open if you need me.
Yeah, I was like, oh, sir. Okay.
Okay. I see you. Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think it all boils down to like an essential Bergman thesis. His constant sort of examination / criticism of bourgeoisie, and particularly of like, prominent roles in society. These people who get all the accolades, but in his opinion, know nothing of the human soul. And here we have our protagonist. He's this learned doctor, traveling across Sweden to get this great honor, like professor emeritus type, or not emeritus, professorial honor, and yet he really knows nothing of the human heart. And I think that because that part of him is like, he's emotionally stunted almost. There's a part of him that is emotionally frozen, in his family's like summer archipelago house. So of course he's going to treat the women around him less than great, because he's a boy. He hasn't really grown up. And that's kind of what this journey is it's forcing him to look all these people in the face, to look himself in the mirror, and grow up.
I think that's a really good point. There's a reason why he's being drawn back to the strawberry patch at like his childhood summer home. He is emotionally stunted, and there's no way that you would know that if we don't get the point of views from the women and the way they talk about him. Sarah, they were in love. She eventually married his brother.
Right.
But she's talking about how she wants to love this man, but she's not getting anything from him emotionally. He pretends like it's fine if you are with someone else. And obviously it's not, because he's hung up on this woman, but he doesn't know how to express it. And the same we get a scene later with his wife, who we learn has been deceased. That trial that he's going through essentially, and he's being brought to watch this scene that supposedly we find out he's already lived through and was watching. So his wife is kind of running around with a man. You don't know. Your automatic assumption is that she's cheating on him. She eventually, unfortunately, is assaulted by this man. And when she's talking about it, she's talking to the audience, not face on, but she's talking out loud. And she's saying, when I go back and tell him this, he's just going to say, I feel bad for you, with no love or actual care. It's more so, I feel nothing other than that sucks. And that kind of shifts your thought on him. At least for me, it did. I don't know for you.
What did it shift it? What do you mean? What did it shift it to?
When you're like, oh, so this, it might just be because when you're hearing this man kind of reminisce about his life, you think, oh, he's an old, sweet man. He's very nice to his daughter-in-law. He seems to be very sweet with everyone. When we get to like the Max von Sydow character and his wife, he's like, you've done so much for us and the people in this town. Everyone's talking about all the great he's done, but like his personal life, not that he was a bad person, he just didn't seem to open up and offer his love to anyone.
Yeah.
So you're like, what was the disconnect there between the people he doesn't really know that well to the people in his actual life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's kind of an essential mystery that lies at the core of the film, and it's an essential mystery that lies at the core of Bergman himself. I mean, the film, even though the film follows this man at the end of his life, Bergman wrote it when he was 37, which is shocking. And his third marriage was falling apart. He'd been having an affair with Bibi Andersson since she was 18, and that was falling apart. And he'd already ruined 2 marriages. He was on like non-speaking terms with his parents, and he just sort of, he just was that like misanthropic, moody, workaholic, artist that people in the 60s, or in the 50s in Europe thought was like really cool. Like he was living up to that sort of like image. And I think he was even kind of beholden to that archetypal kind of character, to a fault. And so he kind of pours all that into this character of this old man. But I think at the core, like what you're saying, like at the core is Bergman himself. And it's the part of him that is, I don't say it's like it for me. It doesn't mean that I don't want to watch his movies, knowing that he was a difficult person. But I think it's interesting that he was grappling with his own failings and shortcomings as a human, so directly in his art.
It's interesting. It's like this was his own form of therapy. Like he didn't actually want to go to therapy. So he's like, I'll write about how I know I'm not the best person. I'm not going to change anything about it. But, he was always very self-reflective, even in the later, like the documentary about him, Bergman's Island, where he's talking about himself. And he's like, yeah, I know I was like this. It's just, I can't excuse it. That was my way of going about life. I think it's the same with this character too, where he is realizing, how he affected other people. And we see it very clearly, not only just in the women in his life, but we eventually meet his son, because we've been traveling along with him and his daughter-in-law, Marianne. And we're wondering, where is the son? What's the deal? They seem to have, are they on a break? Are they divorced? Where is he? And then we get like a scene of she's recounting what happened, why they're not really communicating right now. Turns out she's pregnant. He doesn't want to have a child. The reason why is because in his mind, he grew up as an unwanted child from a broken marriage, and he doesn't want to pass that along. Marianne says, when I met our protagonist's mom, she's like, this is like the coldness has been passed down from parent to parent to parent. And she's afraid this is going to be passed down. How do you feel about that scene just in general? Because it's dark. There's darkness throughout, but I think to me, that's one of the darkest scenes. Just his anger within that scene.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's absolutely heartbreaking. I think it's so sad, but in such a real way.
Mm-hmm.
That Bergman continually like finds these stories in the mundane fabric of our lives, and he does not put any unnecessary violence, extravagant plot points just to like keep your attention. He just keeps it so fucking real. And that scene is the epitome of that, because it is just so heartbreaking and it's so sad, and it's something that I can relate to. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's something that I would have said when I was younger, before I became a dad, and I've never even thought about this until like at this moment right now. I would have said it not because of its reality, but I would have said it because of my own fear of the responsibility. And the responsibility that once one is aware of these habitual patterns that are passed down, once you become aware of it, you're kind of responsible to do your part to change it. And I think that the really sad thing about the scene is that the son admitting that he is not willing to change it, that he feels beholden to it. And in a way, like, it's the thing that he hates about himself, but also kind of like secretly loves, because it gives him his identity. And he probably has conflated it with success, because that's what his father has. And so all that's really sad. And like all that is just buried in the subtext of this very simple conversation between a husband and wife talking about how they don't want to have a kid. And that is why Bergman is a genius. And that kind of circles my head back around to something that you said earlier about, Bergman was very self-aware that he was kind of a shithead, and, he didn't want to go to therapy, but he did want to write about it. The one thing that I do think separates him from a lot of other artists that, exhibit those traits is, I do think that, I mean, I don't want to say like a total blanket statement of like, he never does this, but I think on the whole, he does not glorify or make those parts of himself appear sexy in films.
No, not at all. Polar opposite of that.
Yeah, like you watch his movies and you're like, I don't want to be Ingmar Bergman. I mean, I would love to be as talented as him, but I don't want to be him. I don't want to be dealing with his problems. It doesn't seem cool. I guess gold star for that.
Yeah. Jeez. I definitely feel that it's very much, he never glorifies it. I can't think of a single film where he's like, it's cool to be this tormented about life and religion, and just like my every thought is this real? Is life worth it? Because that runs throughout every film, and you're like, it's kind of stressful and consuming, although he doesn't make it like overbearing or unbearable, I find. But it is there, and like it's there in this film too. We've got Isak, who is grappling with, even at his old age, is God real? What was the point of all this? And that's just like a running thing through all of his films. And I could totally understand if that's tiresome to someone. And as someone who doesn't, like, I'm not a religious person and I don't grapple with those thoughts, but I am so interested by people who are. And that's why I keep coming back to his films. But, we talked about how he has like a huge body of work. He has certain themes that he likes to explore kind of over and over again. He does differently. But if we're talking about him as an artist, how do you feel about an artist who is just like so kind of fixated on something and seems to want to get it out in a certain way? Does it bother you? Do you not care?
Oh no, I love it. I mean, I think that as artists, like, a great artist probably has like 3 things to say. The rest of us probably have like 1 thing to say. The hard thing is figuring that out, like what that thing is. And he's got it. And he knows exactly what he's grappling with, and he doesn't stray. He doesn't get distracted by the glitz and glamour along the path. He stays true to his inner truth, and like that's what makes him great. So I'm all for it. And I love I love his whole battle with God and spirituality and Christianity. And of course, for those who don't know, his father was not a preacher. I don't know what the right word
clergyman.
is. Yeah, but like for like a Protestant, so he's like some sort of Protestant. Father was like a priest, or whatever, and he was raised like in an extremely rigorous religious household, where he like every hour of his day was sort of somehow dictated by the religious expectations of his father. And so it left a huge impression on him, and he battled with it for the rest of his life. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, same. No complaints from me here on that. I could watch Bergman grapple with the fear of Jesus Christ himself every day of my life. Like, I don't mind at all. But it's interesting that you say, they're good artists only have a few things to say once they figure it out, and they can do it over and over again in different ways. This is a man who, I know I keep saying he has a lot of films, but he also wrote all those movies. How he had the stamina to do that, I will never know. And his films are dialogue heavy.
Well, hold on. Because like, that's not even the full picture, because this motherfucker was running the Malmo theater, and he was producing, directing, and sometimes writing 2 to 3 plays a year, and then the films would only get made in the summer.
Yeah.
So this, I mean, like, no wonder, he wrote this film in the hospital because he had a ulcer, like a stress ulcer.
Yep.
And it's like, no fucking wonder, and because the guy, he was certainly driven and compelled and a little insane, to pursue this art form in the way that he did. He was kind of constantly like eschewing adulation. He famously like refused to show up to any like award ceremony. He hated to like, he never showed up to like talk to anybody about his movies. He would never go to like universities and talk about them or anything. I think he was deeply afraid of criticism in any way, shape, or form. So, but he had this internal psychotic drive, to say this shit, and probably also, that just a very pedantic kind of need to prove himself over and over and over and over again. So yeah, I mean, but like, no, thinking about his output, because in the context of his theater work, is even more like mind-blowing. Yeah. I'm getting an ulcer just thinking about it.
For real. It takes me like to do any sort of creative work. This is my only creative outlet for now, and that this took me a long time to even get the nerve up to do it, let alone be writing multiple plays a year, let alone within a decade.
I just came off set 2 days ago, and Felicia and I were joking before we got on the mic. I'm like, man, I'm so glad it's over. I mean, like, it was amazing. I'm so grateful. It was absolutely beautiful, but God, am I tired. The thought of I like, okay, like, got to switch to my like theatrical production that like my entire like my living is based on, and my reputation is based on, and if I fuck this one up, like, it's all in the gutter all over again. That's would be that would be really hard.
Yep. So you can kind of understand, not excusing, but understand the fact that he might not have been the most personable person to be around. But speaking of his theater, it does translate to a lot of his films, and the blocking, the framing of his films is something that every time I'm watching, I just like, as dialogue heavy and as much of a tell type of person he is, the show part is still very relevant. And we get a lot of famous shots from his films of just the framing and how he places the actors. And we get it a lot in this. If we want to talk about, Marianne and Ewald, when they're out in the rain and they're having that argument and they're kind of standing there, looking at each other, and it's just so beautifully framed. There is a scene in this film, though, that always sticks with me visually because there's no actual dialogue, and it's one of the dreams he's having with Sarah, and she hears a baby off in the distance and she's running to go get the baby, and like the score changes right away. The look of the film changes right away. It's all of a sudden, if you were to just see that scene, you would assume we're in a horror film. I love that scene. You're not, I guess you do remember it, and just like, how do you feel about, I just kind of want to talk about that film or that scene, because I'm kind of gushing of like, it's a very quick, but it's so beautifully done. It's kind of out of the rest of the film.
Yeah. Well, this film does some great sort of like straddling between like on location filming and then like clear studio lot. And that's a moment where like you watch B.B. Anderson run through a real forest and then immediately step onto a studio lot where there's this like perfectly made like craggy tree branch forming this shadow behind her that sort of like frames her head as she like reaches down and picks up this baby from the crib, and the baby's like clearly not real, but it's also like you've kind of, even with the change into the studio lot setting, you've drifted into sort of an artificial like symbolic world, and you kind of just take it for as is. And it does take on this surreal, horror like quality, kind of foreshadowing like a lot of stuff that he would do with Hour of the Wolf, like a few years later. Yep. I love spooky Bergman.
Same. So do I. We don't get it as often.
No.
But I think he does spooky a little bit better than he does comedy. I do like some of his comedies, but they're not on my, top 10 list of Bergman films.
No. Yeah.
Before I forget, I do want to talk about, because I had never thought about this until I was doing a bit of research on the final scenes. So Isak lies his head down on the pillow and he's kind of going to sleep, ending his day. I just was like, okay, it's the end of the film. He's going to sleep. I didn't think that deep into it. People think that they've been looking into the pillows. They're like, it's the same pillow that he woke up on. So he was dreaming the whole thing, the whole day he dreamt. I didn't read it that way. Did you see it that way at all? Do you see why they would think that? I don't really.
Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's literally like a white pillow. I'm like,
yeah, I know.
And newsflash, like when you're making a movie, like you got to make decisions real fast, and like they probably just didn't have another pillow like on the lot. No, I think people that would think that are reading way too much into very mundane details of a movie. And no, he definitely made the trip to Lund, and he's sleeping in a different bed, and he's just having one last dream that, and it's such a sweet dream. It makes him whole.
Truly.
So I don't like, what would that even add to the movie?
I don't know. They're like, oh, it's like a huge dream within like several dreams going on into the one dream. And I was like, I never thought about that. But then I saw people having like a full on debate on the internet about it.
But what does that add?
I don't know. Sometimes when you're like, some people you read there, I want to support most people's opinions on things, or at least hear them out. But sometimes I'm like, you could just let it go. Just watch the movie.
Just watch the movie. I think like people, like if that's what you've latched onto, I'm sorry, you have missed this film.
Yeah,
you have missed it, and I suggest you go back and watch it again.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, I was like, there's already like, there's a lot going on in this film. I don't think he's hiding anything in that last scene. But
No.
also, like you said, what would that add if he had been dreaming the whole day? Like, what would be the difference if he didn't?
Who gives a shit?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you agree. Because people think, well, I'm sure you might get this too. If you have a film podcast, they're like, oh, you must be reading into all the things. I'm like, sometimes I'm just watching movies, you know?
No, that's the thing. That's what's so like. I hate how like why do we have to bake conspiracies into movies? Like,
Yeah.
the movies are saying what they mean to say. There's not hidden messages in everything. Like, save that for fucking QAnon. If you want to fucking chase breadcrumbs, like there's entire like just go to fucking 8kun and like do that shit somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because movies are meant to be accessible to everyone. And this like speaks to the greater problem that like I also encounter a lot as a film podcast, which is that like there are no gates. There's no gatekeeping. Like all these things are accessible. The only gates are in your mind of why you would not potentially want to do this. And the whole notion that there are esoteric occult sort of symbols baked into every piece of art is absolutely laughable to me. Like, dog, it's hard enough to write like 3 good sentences in a row, much less 3 good sentences and like a whole secret sentence underneath them. Like that's fucking crazy.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I don't believe in gatekeeping art. For me, the reason why I'm doing this is because I just want to nerd out with people about a movie. Like that's why I do this. This is why I go, attend a film club. Where I'm like, I just want to talk to people about movies. If some people want to go super in depth and want to read into, the color grading that happened there, was there a reason? That's up to you. I'm not gonna go about my day and do that. But sometimes it's just nice to enjoy the art for what it is. And trust me, a lot of the time, these filmmakers, artists are not thinking that deeply. They're like, we just had this that day.
Yeah. Dude, yeah. You are just doing whatever you can to just get the fucker done. Like,
yeah.
Trust me.
Well, and I'm sure Bergman was also like, hey, I need to get home for dinner. So,
I'm not sure he ate dinner. I think he was mostly like, I need to get home because I've got theater rehearsal at 5. And
what a life. My God.
Yeah. Hey, I do just want to add this little like personal thing, which is that so in this film, Isak drives from his home in Stockholm and he drives down to Lund. And I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago. My wife and I have a childhood friend of ours who has immigrated to Sweden and lives there now. And about like 7 years ago, we went to Sweden, and she was dating this guy at the time. And we were there. We were not there in the summer. We were there in the winter. But we drove from their house in Stockholm to his parents' house in Helsingborg, which is very, very close to Lund. And so we drove this exact highway that they drive in the movie. And it was funny. It was like, so you know how the middle part of the movie, they drive by that giant lake. They have lunch at the lake where the two like suitors start arguing about God. Yeah. So that's there's these 2 giant kind of Great Lakes in the middle of Sweden, and that's Lake Vättern. Any Swedes listening can correct my pronunciation. And so as we were driving by that lake, I suddenly had those scenes hit my brain, and I looked at the road we were on, and then I looked up Wild Strawberries. I was like, where was he driving to again? And then I traced his road, and I was like, oh my God, we're driving the road. Sweden is huge. It's so much bigger than you would think. It's like it like stretches from like Florida to Maine. And this drive from Stockholm to Lund, it's like 8 hours, and it's over just like a tiny part of southern Sweden. But it'd be the equivalent of like driving from my house in Georgia, like up to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have driven this road that he
That's
drives,
amazing.
and it was dope.
I'm jealous. Sorry, in the background, I'm just looking at the size of Sweden on the map. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't realize how big it was.
It's giant.
Still haven't been to that part of Europe, and that's always been a dream of mine to go over there and just kind of do those parts of Europe.
So cool.
But I definitely did not realize it was that big.
All of Scandinavia is so awesome. I have like a lot of Norwegian blood in me, and I think that like it starts to boil like when I'm in that part of the world. My wife whose family is Indian like loves to tease me because I get like extra white when I'm up there. I'm also very tall. You know, I'm like 6'4", and everyone there is really tall. And Felicia, this might not make total sense to you, but the urinals are extra tall inside.
Are they?
So, and it's because listen, this is maybe TMI for the podcast, but like, you know, I'm always having to like aim down, I'll have to squat down. You know, the urinals are not built for me, even in America, but in Sweden, the urinals are perfect.
There you go. I didn't realize the population was taller there, but now that I'm thinking of all like the Swedish actors, I'm like, that makes sense. They all look very tall.
Max von Sydow is super tall. Gunnar Bjornstrand is just tall. Yeah.
I wonder how tall Bergman was. He's probably just like tall for North America, maybe short for Sweden.
Yeah. Maybe he's deceptively tall because he's always sitting in every photo.
Yeah, that's true.
He's always like sitting and
just
brooding.
Lounging. Now I got to Google the height. But are there any, I know this is a big film, but are there any specific parts that we haven't covered that you would like to chat about?
Well, I think the only thing is just like the outsized impact of the lead actor, Victor Sjöström. And you know, this guy was an absolute legend. I mean, I was like looking up his filmography today. He started making movies. He directed his first film in 1912. That's 2 years. That's 2 years before Chaplin even appeared in a movie. So that's how far back in the silent era he went. And, you know, he was like the great silent auteur of Sweden. And he came to America. He directed a bunch of movies in America. He struggled with the transition to talkies, so he went back to Sweden. He was, you know, director, actor, but he had been retired and was serving as sort of like a overseeing director of the Swedish Film Institute. And he was critical in helping Bergman get his foot in the door. Because Bergman's first film, Crisis, was kind of a flop, and he's the one who vouched for him. And so, and this was his last performance, and it was the last time he had acted in years. And I think it's hard to kind of account for the relationship that Swedish audiences would have had with him, you know, having grown up with him. You know, like I was reading something today that he was once upon a time considered like the most handsome man in Sweden. He was like the Swedish sex idol. And so to see him as this, you know, little old man reflecting on his life and his lost loves and his failures and all these things, and he just delivers such an incredible performance. I mean, this movie would be a quarter of what it is, I think, without him. It's kind of one of those amazing, like, last gasps of a truly great artist who just kind of poured himself into this final role, and then he died like a couple of years after it was made, and that's just amazing.
It is. It's nice when you get someone like a Bergman who understands the impact of an artist and is able to give them that sort of final goodbye to both their audiences. Because I recently watched Phantom Carriage, recognized the names, but didn't put them together right off the bat, and I was like, oh my God. Cool. Like, I can't believe this is the same guy who directed, and he also stars in The Phantom Carriage.
Yeah.
And you look at, like, that movie came out in 1922, 1921, and then, you know, fast forward. just the stark difference there. And it's always insane and really cool to see someone who was just an artist for so long in their life. And this is like a sweet goodbye.
Yeah.
It's one of Bergman's sweeter films. You know, he wasn't putting him through the trenches of something like A Cries and Whispers, where they're fully tormented the whole time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Did you read this little detail that like I think this might even just be on the Wikipedia page, that like in order to convince him to do it, Bergman was like, "Oh yeah, it's real easy. You just have to like sit in a field and you just remember stuff. It's super easy."
That's funny. He's probably like, yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah. But then he got to set and he was like super upset, and like it was really hard, and like he was complaining about everything, and it was like long.
Yeah, I mean,
he's in every fucking scene.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like I'm not relaxing. I'm in almost every scene of this movie he's in. I mean, you got to do what you got to do. Sometimes you got to lie to people. Sometimes you got to lie to your actors. I think I say that as someone who hasn't dealt with actors in a while, but no, I think that's a great place to bookend our Wild Strawberries chat. But before I fully let you go, I do have the final questions that I still do, and credits. So I know I keep repeating myself, but Bergman has a lot of movies, and I don't know if this would be the one you would recommend they start off with if they've never seen a Bergman. If it is, why? If not, which of his films would you recommend?
You know, I think this might be what I would recommend. It was my first Bergman. And if you see something in this movie, then you're going to love what else he's got in store for you. If you don't like this movie, like maybe you're not really ready, or, you know, maybe it's just not the time yet. And which is like total. I say that not as like not to be condescending. Cause like sometimes like, I mean, you know, like sometimes I'm not in the mood for Bergman. Yeah, but I think this is a great starter.
Yeah, it's weird because when I knew I was going to do the Bergman one, and because he's like top 3 director for me, I was like, which one would I recommend? And then going back and rewatching all of this stuff, when I got to Wild Strawberries, I was like, this is the one. I think if I were to recommend one, it would be like, it has to be this one because it gives you everything that he has to offer, but isn't like the stark darkness that he can go down that path sometimes. And it's not as philosophical. It is, but it's not like, you know, Seventh Seal. And it's not one of his comedies. It's not one of his horrors. It mixes all of those things in like the perfect blend. And I think, as you said, if you don't like this, it's either just not for you or you're maybe not ready. And I also say that not in a condescending way. It's like sometimes you aren't in the place of your life or frame of mind to watch a certain movie. And sometimes you might watch something and not like it and like it at another later day. But I think if you don't like this one, then maybe wait and give it another chance later before you move on. So yeah,
totally.
Double bill question. So what film are you pairing this with? And it can be more than one, but what film are you pairing this with? And what's the reasoning behind the pairing?
Well, you know, like the first one that comes to mind is like Amour, you know, sort of, you know, reflections on your life kind of vibe. I feel like I could come up with like a sexier answer than Amour, but I'll go with Amour. You know, cute little old men.
Yeah. I mean, hey, that was one that it came across my radar because there's different ways you can go about it. For some reason, this one sparked a lot of different ones, so I'll kind of just rapid fire them, and they all kind of have the same reasoning. It's like older men now reminiscing about their youth.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I got Broken Flowers, Jarmusch film.
Oh, okay.
You know, he's going around this is different. He's trying to find, you know, the woman and the child that he supposedly is a father of, but he's going back through and visiting all of his older lovers. So we've got that. We got Tokyo Story, it's a little different. You know, we got the older couple who are visiting, you know, their kids or their son, I believe.
Yeah.
And they're just reminiscing there. The other one, which is the sweeter one, Cinema Paradiso. I thought that would be a nice one. Different way of reminiscing about your life, but just kind of the snapshots of youth and what made you the person you are today. And the last one, which is the first time I'm able to actually bring this film up in a pairing, which is wild because it's my all-time favorite, but it's The Swimmer, Frank Perry film. And this is a man, I don't want to give too much away, but he is in a way reminiscing about a past life that seems to have slipped away. That's all I can say without spoiling it. So if you want to watch older men who cannot communicate but want to think about their youth and holding on, then we've got all those.
Yeah. Maybe you could also watch Up.
Yeah. Why not? Up and Wild Strawberries, double bill.
Up and Wild. Hey, sign me
I would
up.
go see it.
Yeah,
I would be there front row. Let's go. But yeah, I'm sure Bergman would love that.
Yeah,
compared to the Pixar movie, maybe who knows? Maybe he'd be a huge fan. But Aaron, thank you so much for tackling Wild Strawberries with me. I was so happy to rewatch it because it had a much greater effect on me this time around. So I'm really happy to have rewatched it, to talk to you about it. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on. Oh, the most obvious pairing of all, Big Daddy. Shout out Jeffrey Horn and his old balls. Thank you so much for having me on. And honestly, thank you, Jeffrey Horn, for recommending this movie to me when I was 16 years old.
There you go. Yeah. See, callback. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia Moroni, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on Winter Light.